Hello, and welcome to Unraveling the Universe, where we will dive deep into the spiritual and metaphysical universe. Today, I will be interviewing Alec Figueroa from the Research Center for Developing Consciousness. Now, Alec's work is amazing because he has been examining and dissecting metaphysical and cognitive phenomenon for over 10 years. Additionally, he's been producing independent research and materials surrounding the mind's eye, aphantasia, psionics, and consciousness. And so today in this interview, we're going to not only dive deep into his work, but also into how it relates to psychic phenomena. So let's get right into this. I'm super excited. Hey, Alex. Thank you so much for joining me today. And I'm so excited to talk with you about all these amazing things that we're going to get into about, aphantasia and prophantasia. And I know our audience probably has no idea what we're talking about, but we're going to talk about it and figure it all out together. So let's get into these things. First of all, Alex, tell me a little bit about you. How did you even get into this whole arena in the first place?
In the aphantasia stuff specifically?
Well, I guess any of it. How did you get into like this spiritual arena that you're in? Because I know that you do coaching, and I'm interested in also you do intuition training and psionics and things like that. So clearly, you've studied a bunch of different things to get you into this arena, and then also into aphantasia. So, however we get into these different things in this circuitous pathway, tell me what you want to tell me.
Okay, so let's start with I'll start by describing the aphantasia work because that's the newer of the two realms that I work in. But yeah, so aphantasia has been interesting. The first time I ever heard about it was back in I want to say 2010. I had a roommate we were living with, so I was going to this spiritual training school in Northern California, and we had a house of guys that I was living with, and always talking about spiritual stuff and things. And he told us one night, yeah, I can't do that. I can't think of whatever you guys are trying to like envision. And the rest of us were just like, what are you talking about? You can't, what? And he goes, yeah, I closed, like nothing's there. And we're like, well, you're not supposed to see it. It's like, in the mind, you're supposed to get an idea of what it looks like in the mind. And he goes, nope, can't do it. And we're like, okay, I had never considered that somebody couldn't think visually, right? I'd always just been a natural visual thinker myself. And so that got the wheel turning a little bit on that topic. Come to find out, my cousin also experienced the same thing, even more profoundly than him, I would say, which I found out later. But at that time, there was no research. It hadn't been named yet as a phenomenon or a condition, as they call it. I prefer to call it a phenomenon. So it's kind of in the back of my mind. And then finally in 2018, I ran across the actual research around it, where now it had been coined since 2010. Now there was a big paper that came out in 2015 that was very important for the field. And 2018, I ran across all of that. And I went, okay. Actually, it might have been mentioned in 2010, but coined in 2015. I may be getting those ones mixed. But 2015, I ran across that research, and the term finally aphantasia. And I went, that's it. That's the thing my cousin's talking about, right? Yeah, and that jump started my own just deep dive, as you were saying. We were talking before. I like that phrase. My own deep dive into the topic to try to understand what was going on, and of course, my brain just went straight to, well, okay, if this is happening and people out there actually don't want that experience, how can we problem solve it? What might affect it, And so did my first experiment, worked with the first person, which was my cousin. It worked. I put up some videos in the very beginning, like, hey, this worked. I don't know. Let's try it. And people just started reaching out. Right. So flash forward to now, a couple 100 students in my e-course, worked with close to 100 one-on-one. People get success, some don't. I'm very transparent about that because we need to be. yeah, it's been a fun journey in terms of the aphantasia stuff and trying to figure out, okay, better lingo, better language for what's a mind's eye experience. What is the visual imagination like?
Mm-hmm.
What are the bigger universities doing, and how can I kind of take what those research firms are working on, expand upon it with my own language, and add what I can to the topic.
Mm-hmm.
Just doing my
Mm-hmm.
little piece.
So, in
And
one of
then
the videos that I was watching, you talked a little bit about how, like, aphantasia and phantasia like works in the brain, and how. Can you explain a little bit about like, or I don't know, like if you're able to talk about how the two hemispheres of the brain and the something about the corpus callosum and how that works? Did
not necessarily the corpus callosum. I wouldn't know about that in terms of
uh-huh.
visualization. Though there are, so according to what limited fMRI data we have, for
Mm-hmm.
those who might not know that term, functional magnetic resonance imaging is what that stands for. It's a big machine that takes essentially a series of cross sections through bodily
Mm-hmm.
tissue. We can also see what areas of the brain are lighting up, so to speak, with metabolic activity through an fMRI. So, um, according to the limited fMRI data that we do have with people that experience aphantasia, it seems like people that are not able to process thoughts visually, their brain is relying on different areas to process
Mm-hmm.
that thought. And one of the main areas that it's processing with has, I can't remember the name at the moment, but it has to do with linguistic recall on the left side.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like right over here, right above your ear.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it has a name. I just never remember what it is. So, person with aphantasia that's not able to generate visual imagery in their mind, their brain may have an over reliance on that area. I say may because we need a lot more data to be able to say definitively that is what's happening. Um, I believe fMRI studies need to happen en masse for within this field, and they're just expensive and slow.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as opposed to a regular visualizer, like a normal average person who can visualize, when they think of an image, the visual cortex back here is active. So their brain seems to be processing
Gotcha.
that thought with the visual centers of the brain instead of that word center. So it may be like an over reliance on the use of words to process thought. Um,
Gotcha. Okay, yeah, because I don't know, I think it was the video that you had referred to in one of your videos was talking about let's see, it was I think image streaming and going in about image streaming, and I think it was talking a bit about um, the two hemispheres of the brain. That one side of the brain works in language, the other side of the brain works in pictures or something like that. And then essentially like taking information from one side of the brain to the other side of the brain. And I couldn't understand exactly what they were talking about with all of that,
mm,
but I didn't know if that related to like what you had been talking about or not. But it sounds like it's a little bit different.
yeah. I mean, that's a similar concept. So back when I ran across the topic of aphantasia, I started trying to formulate ideas of how to tackle the topic, um, and how to actually problem solve around it. One of the thoughts I had was, okay, well, if the brain is relying on this center that processes words and language, what if we just kind of get that center to cross communicate, so to speak, with the place that's sensory processing senses?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And then even I back then ran across image streaming too. That work was pioneered by Win Wenger. He's a philosopher and scientist. I don't think he was a neuroscientist. I'm forgetting at the moment,
Yeah.
but he pioneered the term image streaming in this process he came up with. So I ran across that, and it was already in line, kind of what I was already thinking. Maybe a good solution, which is using words to describe things that you see. His version is things that you see. My version, I tweaked it.
Mm-hmm,
Took that general idea and tweaked it. But so my idea was, well, if we can get those two centers of the brain that are firing at different times to fire at the same time, maybe there will be some cross communication, and maybe those that some, I don't know, neurological neurosynaptic bridges would be formed between the two areas.
mm-hmm.
Now, I still don't know if that's actually what happens, because I'm still such a small operation just on my own. And,
Right.
we need more fMRI data. Like I said, I can't wait till I can get myself into a first fMRI study to see before and after, right? Okay. Brain was doing this before, now it's doing that now. But so it's still just theory. We don't know yet, but, yeah. So similar idea to what you had said.
Well, I think it's so fascinating, first of all, that like we're not even aware of how we all perceive things inwardly, right? Whether or not we have that inner visual mechanism, whether or not we are visualizing things, or whether we don't have the capacity to visualize things. And like you said, this is a fairly recent phenomenon that people have figured out, because we're talking about these things, about what we're experiencing inwardly, and then realizing, oh, wait a minute, you can't do what I can do. And then, like you, I started finding these things like on YouTube or whatever, and they're talking about, and it just blew my mind, like, wait a minute, you don't see things like in your mind's eye, and how is that even possible? Or additionally, and we'll talk about this later too, but the inner voice. So like, you don't have an inner dialogue either. Like, those are things, like, I can't imagine a world where I'm not experiencing these things. But what I really liked was like you're really explaining the difference between, like, for an example, aphantasia and prophantasia, which we'll get into shortly, which for me, like, I had a really hard time understanding what having an inner visual world meant. Like, when I'm thinking about inner visual world, and I'm expecting to see things, like when I shut my eyes, and like when I shut my eyes, I'm expecting, oh, like people who are visual, or visual, like inner visual seers, like they're going to see things, projected in that inner world when they shut their eyes, like against their lids or whatever. And so I'm expecting this. And so I'm thinking, oh, I must have aphantasia. I must not be able to do this because I can't see these things. And then when I came across like your videos, and you're discerning between these differences, and I'm like, oh, I actually have hyperphantasia, and I don't have a very strong prophantasia. So can you explain like what these things are, and like the differences, so that people can understand these things a little bit better?
Absolutely. So this has been like one of the main areas that I've tried to tackle the past almost 6 years now, doing the work that I've been doing within this realm. So you have, let's start with one of the spectrums. Let's start with the mind's eye, right? What we're calling the mind's eye, inner vision, visual imagery. The experience of visual imagery will be on a spectrum of vividness, right? So theoretically, somebody at the bottom of the spectrum, down where no images happen, that would be called what we call aphantasia. As you start moving up the spectrum, maybe now slight visual components are starting to come in. So maybe like the sense of a shape, maybe the sense of a color, usually not combined. They're usually separate for people at that area of the spectrum. We call that hypophantasia, so weak mind's eye activity. Then you'd have maybe a little over midway up the spectrum of vividness on a 100% scale, let's say, around 50 to 70%, you'd have where most people are at. So yeah, they're having visual thought, but there's still a lot of details missing, right? Then at the top of the visual mind's eye vividness spectrum, you'd have what you just mentioned, hyperphantasia. So your mind's eye may be just as vivid as actually seeing, at least depending on what you think about. If something's more familiar and emotionally impactful, it's going to be naturally higher on the scale, I found. So that's kind of the range that we have language for at this point of mind's eye experience. But here's the kicker, is that entire spectrum I'm describing right there, most of those people I have found in interviews and the work that we've done so far, the studies that we've done so far, I've worked on a couple. We're going to be publishing some papers with some neuroscientists in the UK. According to that work, most of those people, no matter who I just described, when they close their eyes, they still just see black. So that's I love to hang on that point because that for a lot of people is like a moment of, oh shoot. Oh, they still just see black.
Yeah.
Even the
That was a huge
hyperphantagics.
moment for me.
Right. Yeah. So most of us are still just going to see black. And yes, many of the hyperphantagics still see black too. Some of them don't, though. Some of them do have an overlap between hyperphantasia and prophantasia, but hyperphantagics already seem like the vast minority of people, at least from the data we have so far. So kind of tells you how rare the other one is. So yeah, stays black, but it's in somewhere else that you're able to process the feeling, I like to say, of an image. Now that phrasing I just said, the feeling of an image, that I came up with myself along the way. But then later, years later, I think it was probably a year and a half ago now, I went back and read in detail some of the papers that came out initially around the topic, because I never really sat down and read them fully. I always skimmed them. And I noticed in the paper in 2010, that team phrased it the same way, that the visual images in the mind are best described as a feeling of sight, as opposed to an actual sight, as opposed to a physical sight, right?
Yeah. I love that. Because I always say it's like you know that you're seeing something, but you don't see it. So I put it like a knowing seeing, but not really a seeing.
Yeah, and those impressions of visual components, depending on how vivid they are, is what will land somebody on that visual imagery spectrum. That'll determine where they're at. So that's mind's eye. And then to dig into the term prophantasia, so I actually came up with that term. It didn't exist 6 years ago. And the reason I came up with it is because I noticed there was lots of seeming confusion around the topic of aphantasia, mind's eye. What's a mind's eye experience supposed to be like? And I kept seeing day after day the same question being asked. It still is asked just about every week on forums and Reddit and stuff, where people find out about the topic and go, wait, so regular people see stuff? Like actually see, right? And so back in 2018, let me backtrack for a second. So the only reason I was able even to differentiate the two styles of visual imagery, mind's eye versus prophantasia, what we now call prophantasia, is because I lacked prophantasia before. So I didn't always used to be able to do prophantasia. In 2010, I had heard a spiritual teacher talking, and he said something along the lines of, oh, when I close my eyes, I don't just see black. It's like I actually see stuff, colors, movie-like imagery and stuff. And I was like, what? I'd always been a visual thinker, but man, when I heard him say that, I was pretty jealous, in a fun way, not a bad way, but I was like, dang, I want to have that. And he didn't really explain how to get it or how to develop it. The best he said was tear a piece of paper in your mind in half and then look through the tear. And I was like, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, those spiritual people can be a lot like that, where they just like give you a little like nugget, and then you have to like unpack like what that thing really is.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so make a hole so you can look through it, whatever that means. And so I went home and it was just like, well, if I was going to develop that skill for myself, how would I start? And I kind of just meditated and let some ideas come and then started trying stuff, and it worked. So then I went from absolutely seeing nothing with my eyes closed. I could visualize, sure, like we just talked about. But I went from physically not seeing anything to generating some light imagery that would flash and then go away, and some outlines of things. And over the years, I practiced it sporadically and would have very dynamic moments of vivid projected imagery, now we call it. So the prophantasia spectrum, it kind of deserves a spectrum on its own, because it can start at where most of us are at, with closing your eyes and just physically seeing black. There's nothing there. But it can progress to outlines, to vague shapes, to colors start streaming in, right? To images being held there and sustained, all the way up to what we would call, I guess, like extreme prophantasia, where somebody's almost like they're wearing a VR headset when they close their eyes, which from what I can tell seems extremely rare. I've only ran across maybe 3 or 4 people who have even described it over the past 6 years to that extent. And I can't even verify that they actually did experience that, because I didn't get a chance to sit down and do this with them. those four people. So, but yeah, mind's eye versus prophantasia, very important. And what you were saying, a lot of people come across the concept of aphantasia and go, well, I close my eyes, I see just black, I must have aphantasia, right? But not necessarily the case. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I noticed that a lot. Like I was saying earlier when we were talking before this video, like, I had done a few deep dives on, aphantasia on YouTube and found that quite a large percentage of them were referring to aphantasia as the lack of not seeing things like when you close your eyes. And so I'm really curious, like, how many people out there are kind of like confusing the two. And that's why when I came across, your information when you were talking about Prophantasia, like everything finally made sense to me, and I really loved that piece. So this is really why I wanted to get together with you to help like spread this information and make sure that people are really understanding the difference, as well as just really understanding, because like I didn't even understand and had that expectation. Was I really supposed to see something when I closed my eyes? And was that aphantasia? And was inner seeing, like in my mind's eye, really not a visual experience, that it's really more of a mind experience than a visual experience? Like if I'm trying to visualize, a juicy red apple, and I'm seeing, actually a lemon's better. I like a lemon because you can have a visceral, the stronger you visualize it, the more you have a visceral response to like the tartness of the lemon or whatever. So, you're like getting it. But, and it's like, I didn't realize that, but what I really like about you and what I really like about your approach is that you've really taken the time to be what I call the inner scientific observer. Like you're taking the time of like, okay, I'm seeing and experiencing these things. What is it like? What is the difference between, what am I seeing in my mind's eye? And what is that? Where is that image? Like you were describing in one of your videos, where do I see the mind's image? It's not in my leg. It's not in my stomach. It's not in my whatever, it's in this, what I call my mind space. That's my term for it. And so, and just really breaking it down, like, I'm not seeing an image when I close my eyes. I'm having the idea of an image, like a knowingness that juicy red apple or that lemon is there. But I'm not actually like seeing it with my eyes. I'm seeing it with my mind. And so I love that you break these things down. I love that you're really taking the time to understand what these things really are. So I really wanted to thank you for like really taking that time to break these things down.
Yeah, absolutely. That's how my mind works. I find, because without actually taking that time to break stuff down and put proper language around it, nobody can relate. Nobody can understand with each other what the other person experienced,
Yeah.
So actually, my main passion over the past, not even before 2018, since branching back into 2009, was spirituality, right? And metaphysical experience. And the actually having firsthand experience of all that stuff, not just in belief, right? And belief system, but actually experiencing stuff. And that's part of what drove me to try to start putting language to things that were undefined or nebulous, was hearing spiritual teaching that I'm like, but they're not like explaining what that experience was like. And therefore it's not reproducible from the people that are listening. Or if somebody is already experiencing the same thing that the person that was teaching, you'd never be able to connect those dots, because whoever was teaching the session or whatever wasn't explaining how the experience actually occurred.
Yeah. No, I love that you say that too, because that is such a huge problem. Like in the spiritual community in particular, to like a teacher may say like, these particular things, like the teacher that you had or that you experienced, with the Prophantasia and seeing those images. And he's just like, okay, and you just tear this thing and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, oh, wait a minute. Like, how do I actually like duplicate this? How do I create this? How do I, and explain these things, like make these things tangible so that, I have a deeper understanding of these things. And this is like what I really strive to do too, like, and why I really want to break things down into their most simplest terms of understanding, and then make it in a way that you, the person that is working with me or with you or whatever, that they then become their own scientific observer. They're like, when I teach them, in my coaching, for an example, like if we're studying like, clairvoyance or clairaudience, I really want them to go inward and like, where are you noticing these things in your mind space? If you are hearing like your own internal voice, like how do you hear your own internal voice? Where do you hear your own internal voice? What like tonal quality does it have? And then the same thing about guidance, like where do you hear guidance? What tonal quality is it? Does it sound exactly like your own internal voice? But if so, is it in a different area than your own internal voice, so that you're like breaking everything down? Because in that moment, then that the person who's being coached can understand immediately, oh, this is my own internal voice. This is guidance. This is my particular guide. This is my, like higher self or whatever, like all these different things, because they've spent that time figuring it out for themselves. And they know instantly in that moment the difference, because they've spent that time differentiating. And so I love that about like what you're doing as well.
Tends to be more of a scientific approach, what you're describing, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, that's how I've always approached it too, is testing and differentiating and drawing delineations between certain experiences. You're reminding me, I remember this was back when I first had like my spiritual awakening or whatever, 2009. And I wanted to, at the time, I was within a more spiritual or a certain belief context. And so I'm messing with my microphone so I don't peak. But at the time, I remember wanting to hear the voice of spirit or God better, right? And so I remember going, well, hey, like just kind of like a kid playing around, seeing what would work and what wouldn't. I was in my 20s. I go, well, okay, so please repeat the word blue for me, right? And then I just wait and kind of quiet my mind, and my brain would start kicking out the word blue over and over, blue, blue, blue. But it felt sporadic and chaotic and just felt like my own thought, at least my own normal type of thought. And then once I found once I totally settled down and everything just kind of quieted, then there'd be almost another feeling that would kick in where the word blue would be spoken in my mind, and it felt different. It just had a different quality behind it. I could almost say it felt like a breath was on it or a wind behind it, just internally, right? And so that's how I, for myself, kind of like what you're describing, started delineating between just my own chaotic random thoughts and potentially what I was hearing that was actual information from something beyond just my normal mode of cognition.
I love that.
Super fun.
I love
that scientific approach I find is really important, because then it stops being something haphazard that maybe happened one time. And now you actually have a reference point for how to continue to make that reproducible for yourself and other people.
Right, right. And, and it's so quickly, that person, whoever is receiving that guidance, will instantly know, oh, well, that's guidance, or this is my own, imagination, or this is whatever. Like they'll instantly know because they've found like where all the things are. And, additionally, I really like this approach because then it doesn't make me the guru. Like I don't want to be in charge of, your spiritual journey. Like this is your, your path, your journey, your connection. Like I really want people to have their one-on-one relationship. And just like you were doing, in trying to hear like your own connection with that God source, that energy, whatever that is, right? And start to create that connection. That's really the work right there. That's what I love.
You and I have that in common. So we've been connecting today about that. Yeah, 100%.
I love that. I love that. So, um, you've taken this work where you really I don't even know what I'm asking here, so I'm going to pull it together. But like, you've created this understanding of this inner visual experience, right? And how have you combined that or connected that to, that psychic phenomenon, of clairvoyance and of, receiving information visually versus creating that information visually? Like, have you played with that?
So let me make sure I understand the question.
Mm-hmm.
So you're asking, have I played with perceiving maybe externally a piece of actual spiritual information versus creating?
So let me explain a little bit about how I approach things. So when I teach people like how to use like their own mechanisms for like receiving guidance, so I essentially explain that it's the same mechanism, right? So however like you visualize something is the same mechanism of you receiving the guidance. It's just who is in control of that mechanism. So if I am imagining something, if I'm visualizing a juicy red apple, I am in control of the mechanism that's creating the image. And then if I am receiving guidance, then something else is sending me the image through the same mechanism. So I'm curious, does your work, I know that you do coaching and help people with intuition training, or at least I saw that on your website. Is that part of like how you do that as well?
Yeah, so you're framing it a little different than I normally do, but that's essentially what is required to be able to recognize when actual information is streaming in from what may be beyond ourselves or what may be actual external information that we're gathering.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so you kind of learn the canvas, so to speak, of whatever mode you're trying to receive information in, and then I
Mm-hmm.
find the one piece that we didn't mention yet was like brainwave states, and actually
Mm.
quieting the chatter and allowing your conscious self to enter into a state of rest. And then that's where I find the information from quote unquote beyond yourself can start streaming in.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I have played with that, taught that. And that is essential to, I believe, receiving external information. Um, it's like you can practice the mind's eye. So I have a concept in my spiritual side training. I'll call it side training.
Mm-hmm.
But in side training, where I call it jump starting. So let's say somebody's trying to receive some intuitive information about a family member or something, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, they're familiar with their mind's eye. Okay, they can generate mental imagery. Sure, you can use that as a vehicle or a receptacle, so to speak, of external information. Um, and if they're not getting anything, just trying to focus on their family member, nothing's coming through. Well, you can actually jumpstart an image. So one of the exercises I have my clients go through is something along the lines of, okay, imagine this person standing in front of you. And if you look down at their hand and they were holding something that represented their higher self or purpose, what would it be? It's an object. Go for it.
Mm.
So they kind of start by generating, but then there's an aspect that maybe isn't defined that then their intuition or their spiritual, whatever we want to call it, um, can fill in the gap. And typically when I do that exercise with somebody, it yields information that is significant for the person that they're trying to get information on.
Mm.
Here's an example. This was fun. I remember working with a lady and we did this type of exercise and she rested for a second. It wasn't an object in the hand, though, it was an outfit. So see an outfit on the person that, maybe represents something about them, somebody that she was familiar with. And she goes, oh, okay, I got something, but I don't even want to say it. It's so silly. And I was like, go for it. Who knows? And she goes, oh, he's like in a Roman centurion outfit. I don't know. I was like, okay, well, that's cool. So what could that represent? Right. What could it potentially be representing about him? Oh, and she goes, warrior spirit, bravery. Okay. Does that make sense for him? Yeah, it does. Okay. By the way, if you want to take that kind of exercise to the next level, you do it with people they don't know. That's where it gets really fun. right? They
Mm.
start getting information and insights about people they don't know. Get this. So she sees this image. We kind of interpret it. We leave it at that. We don't know. The next day, she texts me and she goes, "You'll never believe this. This person that I was looking in at, it was her brother, just texted me this. I'm not kidding you. We haven't spoke today. I'm not exaggerating. She texted me the picture, and it was him where he took his head, his own head, and photoshopped it onto a Roman centurion." And he said,
No
"I think
way.
I was a Roman in my past life."
Wow. Yeah, totally. And I love that. I love how you triggered that because I wouldn't have thought of that as a tool. So I really like that. Generally, when I use like a trigger tool, it's questions. So, because I feel like, that intuitive or psychic information, it's really hard to receive it just when you're just waiting. Like, and there's nothing to trigger it. There's nothing coming and you're just kind of holding space for it. And there's a whole lot of nothing that happens. So I usually encourage people to ask like questions that will trigger information or downloads or whatever. And that these can come through any of the particular like psychic senses.
Mm-hmm.
But I love that you're creating that visual image for them to start playing with and then giving, and this actually reminds me a lot of hypnotherapy. I studied hypnotherapy for a while and was doing with clients. And you actually have to do that with them too. You have to do like suggestive things. So like, let's say for an example, as you're taking them down, the stairs as they're like relaxing and then they're going down to the door where they're going to open up to their experience, right? And maybe one of their experiences is like this locked door and they're like, well, I can't get through. And they'll be like, maybe there's a key over here, or maybe, if you turn around, you might see something, or whatever. And so you're giving them that power of suggestion that's going to trigger, that particular resolve or idea or thing that they're releasing the stress or anxiety of trying to figure out the answer and going into that visualization of it. So I love
Mm-hmm.
that. They're so awesome. And what a great story.
Yeah, and really, like I find with intuitive information, the mind is limitless in what sort of scene or aspect of itself it can use. You can use any aspect of the mind to gather information, right? It doesn't have to be a visual image. It doesn't have to be a voice. It can be a
Mm-hmm.
sensation on the skin. It can be really anything. And so, any scene, any sort of type of um, whatever works for people can be used to gather intuitive information from potentially external sources that are outside of ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No,
So
I love
I
that.
want to circle back around too, because
Mm-hmm.
we segued from Prophantasia straight into some of the
Oh yeah.
psionic stuff,
Let's
and
let's yeah, let's go.
yeah,
Go for it.
because that part about understanding the difference between mind's eye versus projected imagery is really important, especially I find in the context of spiritual experience or metaphysics or psionics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, my own journey with this. So, like I said, I had a spiritual awakening back in 2009, and admittedly, I'm not very learned on some of this stuff. Like, I haven't read a lot of books. I haven't read a lot of even studies. I've read some key ones in certain fields, in areas, but I'm not very learned. I didn't really. I would kind of pick and pull from pieces that I would hear from people that were talking or videos I would see, and just take that little tiny piece and go play and make stuff and experiment with myself, and that's where I came up with a lot of this stuff. Um, but so in my spiritual journey and in that growth process from 2009 onward, I would hear people and I'd always be so jealous, not always in a healthy way, but I'd always be very jealous of people that would talk about seeing,
Mm-hmm.
what we called in that circle, like being able to see or a spiritual sight. And I had the impression that people that were dynamically seeing information from the spiritual realm or whatever, were always walking around seeing floating holograms in their environment, right? Kind of like Iron Man when he's wearing his helmet and he's got all those holograms floating from him. I had the
Yeah.
impression that
Well, me
that's what was
too.
happening.
Me
right?
too. Yeah, I absolutely thought that too. I mean, I think people kind of make it sound like that's how it's happening.
Right. And a lot of times somebody teaching or telling an experience will say something along the lines of, I had a vision, but they won't ever actually differentiate or describe how that experience occurred and where and what type. And I don't even necessarily think it's entirely their fault. I just don't think we've had language to describe these things very well. I mean, the
Hmm.
field of mind's eye study has only been around since 2010, surprisingly, right? So, um, yeah, so in my journey, I would, just like you, I'd hear and I'd have this impression like, dang, they're like seeing all the time, like just vivid holograms and hallucinations in their environment. I guess I don't see, right?
Hmm.
So at that time, I just decided to use what I did have, which was my mind sight, my mind's eye, and try to see what I could with that. Uh, and so I do tiny experiments where I'd try to see the beings in the room or whatever it was. And then I'd go ask one of those vivid seers that I thought was seeing holographically and ask them, are these where they're at? And they'd be able to verify or not verify.
Hmm.
That over time built my confidence. But it wasn't until around the time of 2018, actually, that I realized that actually most, that's when it really hit home. But along the years, I would ask seers how they're actually seeing. And I
Hmm.
kept hearing a very similar thing where most of them would say that it wasn't something out there. It was
Hmm.
mostly things that occurred in their mind. And then in 2018, it finally hit home where I realized we're not actually talking, most of the time, we're not talking about holographic three-dimensional projections out into our environment or into the
Yeah.
black space when we close our eyes. We're talking about mind sight,
Yeah.
an impression of imagery that occurs in the mind, you know. And when that hit, when that realization turned for me, oh my gosh, what I could see with my mind's eye and the information I could tap into, and then the other types of sight as well started to just blossom and open up. So every type of sight metaphysically started to kind of mature at that point because I was no longer striving or thinking that I was lacking something that I actually had the whole time, if that
Hmm.
makes sense.
Hmm. No, I love that. I
So,
love that.
so yeah, differentiating between mind's eye and projected imagery is really important. And the more I do the research on it and the more that I talk with people and continue to do the work I've been doing, it's clearer and clearer that projected imagery, whether we're talking about spiritual experience or not, even just regular thought processing, is quite rare. It's quite
Hmm.
rare. Can happen, really cool when it does, but it's quite rare.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
um,
no, I came across that as well too, and had that similar journey as yours. And actually, I think like you were part of the process of me realizing, oh, wait a minute, like this is not how it actually happens. Like, and I felt lacking. I felt like, there's something wrong with me, and I'm not seeing these things visually. I'm not having this experience. I'm only seeing it, in my mind as in like an idea, and but I could do some things, like I would play with, in a dark room, and I would rub my eyes, and then I would see like the images and lights and stuff like that, and then I would open my eyes, and you could see that projection, right? You could see the lights and the things that you were seeing when you rubbed your eyes in the dark space. And so then I would actually play with that in a lighter and lighter and lighter room, to the point where I could actually see and project whatever I was seeing inside on my outer experience. And I'm like, okay, so clearly there's a way to do this too. And then, like, how do I do this? And so I've actually experimented with this too. Like, I notice that as I'm starting to fall asleep at night, right? Like, there's a point when, everything's like black and black and black, but then like you start drifting off, and then you start seeing images, but you don't notice that you're seeing the images until you like come back really quick. And then you're like, awake and realizing, wait a minute, I was just in like this story of this experience and I was like almost asleep or whatever. And then as I'm starting to fall back asleep again, and this is where it makes me think of this guru that you were talking about too, about like slicing things open, because what it looks like to me is like the clouds are parting. And as the clouds are parting, I can see like the images, the like whatever that reality is, like against like my inner lids or whatever, as I'm starting to fall asleep. So I'm curious also, like, do we see like those dream experiences, completely inside our minds, or are some of them like also projected like into that like field? Like, I'm curious about that, but it's hard to keep my consciousness like aware of the process as I'm transitioning from the wake state to a dream state. It'd have to be something where I really practice like a strong, like either lucid dreaming or like astral projection awareness. But even then, astral projection for me just takes me right out of my body. So,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, I love that.
Yeah. So what you're talking about, I remember 2011 playing around a lot. I was heavily going after astral projection because I'd have haphazard experience with it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But I wanted it to be something reproducible where I actually learned the process to get into that experience so I could do it when I wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I ran across back then was just on some forum or something where you would lay down and then rest your arm against the wall. And as you would start falling asleep, your arm would fall to wake you up ideally.
Mm-hmm.
And in that moment, you were supposed to try to be aware right after your arm woke you back up, what sort of phenomenon you were experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started to be able to become aware of what phenomenon I was experiencing in my mind. And then also start being aware, not only the moment after I would wake up, but the moment right before.
Mm-hmm.
And I was able to learn what I now call the indicators for me entering into that certain brainwave state, which I now know is like it's likely a theta. If you had
Mm-hmm.
me on an EEG, I'd be in like a theta brainwave state, which is slow. Beta, alpha, theta. Theta is very slow. Delta is the bottom there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so as I was able to recognize those phenomena kicking in, I was able to sort of hang in that moment for longer and longer. And what was really cool is as I became aware of those different phenomena and practicing the awareness of them, they started to kind of come up into the higher brainwave states too. So where I used to need to be in this low theta to have, let's say, a thought become audible or the images come, like you said,
Mm-hmm.
well, now I could start accessing that same phenomena in maybe an alpha. So not quite as
Mm.
relaxed.
Wow.
And then if I'm really practiced, which I'm admittedly rusty based on this past year right now, this craziness of life, but if I'm very practiced and in the flow, then I can even start to have those same phenomena coming up into my waking state, like a beta state, which we're in all the time in our
Wow.
waking life. So
And is that just
that's where
purely
things can
through
get really fun.
practice?
It's always been practice for me. So
Mm-hmm.
I did have some natural talent in terms of what we're talking about, but not a whole lot, I would say. So for
Mm-hmm.
me, it's always just come down to being able to identify, recognize, and then practice the things that I was working on. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very cool. Yeah, no, I love that. I love that. And yeah, I really want to explore these things too, to, see like how you can like make those images stronger. So I know that you have done a lot of experiments with like playing with different tools, inner tools and things like that for, creating like that projected image. Can you tell me a little bit about the things that you've done with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So that I want to mention before I talk about it, I went open source with my info a couple of years back. So all of my exercises, techniques, and concepts, whether somebody pays for my programs or not, are available on my blog, on my
Oh, okay.
website. Yeah.
Very cool.
So
We'll put a
that way,
link
if
to that below. And we'll make sure to do that.
absolutely. So that way, people that maybe don't want to pay for a program or couldn't afford to can still start to play and experiment with themselves, of the
Mm-hmm.
stuff that I've come up with and outline and all that. So where Prophantasia started for me back in the day, this was 2010. After I heard that guy talk about tearing the thing, and I went home and I was like, how does that work? What it was like, or where it started for me, was I would lay down and I would think of a simple shape in my mind's eye first. I think I started with like a triangle or something.
Mm-hmm.
And then just kind of, this is kind of odd to try to describe, but I would imagine that image coming through my head and forward.
Mm-hmm.
So I was trying to like use a mental muscle, so to speak, to drag the image down and forward and hold it out in front of my nose.
Mm-hmm.
And as I'd hold this imaginary kind of little tiny pressure of an image, so to speak, out in front of my face, I would relax and breathe. And then slowly I would be able to see it starting to form an outline of the thing in the black
Mm-hmm.
space as I was laying there. And I found if I did that long enough, then my body would naturally want to start falling asleep. And as I got closer to those slower brainwave states, there'd be a flash of an image I wasn't trying to create that was a vivid outline of something, whether it was a face or an object from the day or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, I'd sit up, write it down, take note, right? And that's how it
Mm-hmm.
started. Like being able to develop Prophantasia was just trying to hold the feeling of an outline of something out in front of me and waiting until it started to appear as I started
So
to relax.
did when you were doing this process, did you have your eyes open and it was the area dark, or did you have your eyes closed? Like, how were you you said, I'm projecting it outside of myself. Were your eyes open to do that?
Closed. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
eyes were closed at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that dragging out process, it's still very hard for me to describe because it's not a physical sort of thing. It's like I
Right.
was trying to take the idea of a mental image and push it out in front of me somehow. But
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
yeah, my eyes would be closed, relaxed, laying down.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
It was later I was able to start recognizing what actually the scientific community calls visual snow, which is kind of like
Mm-hmm.
staticky sparkle, looks like
Yeah.
dots sparkling around. Um, I was able to recognize that a year and a half or so later in my environment with my eyes open. I
Mm-hmm.
realized that, oh, like the outlines I can produce, I can actually draw into the visual snow and produce them on a wall with my eyes open. But that didn't happen right away. That came over time.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Yeah, no, I'm familiar with the visual snow. I actually played with that. A really great way to see the visual snow, at least for me, is because I have a kid. So we do where you lay down in the grass and look up at the clouds. But there's something about looking at the sky with the way that the light radiates through the clouds that makes it really easy to see that visual snow. And you can also see like your eye floaters and all the different like things or whatever. But yeah, so I became like abundantly like aware of that, and also projecting things, like using that as a field to project things onto. So I love that. And I remember watching your video about how you started doing that and how you started projecting the triangle or whatever it was onto that through creating the I can't think of the word, but essentially drawing the snow into the image. So that's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah. It's almost like the snow would clump up into the outline of the thing I was trying to project. Right.
Mm-hmm,
Um,
mm-hmm,
yeah. Yeah. The sky. So there's a couple phenomena that you reminded me of that. If you look at like a blue sky, you relax your eyes, you'll start to
mm-hmm.
see, they think they're white blood cells. I'm not actually totally sure what they are, but like little
Yeah.
white dots flying around. They
Mm-hmm,
kind of
mm-hmm.
zip and then they disappear. Or the floaters, right? Those would look like
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
wormy structures. But then my favorite way, you mentioned your favorite way to start seeing the snow. My favorite way is in a dimly lit room with like just a blank white or cream colored wall. So if you have a
Yeah.
candle on or something in the corner and then you just relax your eyes, that's almost everybody will naturally see a little bit of snow. Not everybody, but almost everybody I find in
Yeah.
that type of environment.
Yeah,
So
yeah. No, and I think, and I'm curious, so like how this relates to like seeing auras and things like this, because, that is the perfect place, right, to start seeing like those types of colors and those types of things. And so I'm really curious, if like what we're seeing as that color is in that same field, that same like snow field, or whatever you want to call that,
I like that
essentially.
snowfield.
The snowfield, right? A new word, snowfield.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, maybe like all the things that we're doing when we're trying to see like auras or see the things outwardly projected are on that snowfield.
Yeah. That, I mean, I love that you said that. That's some of the same conclusion that I came to over the years
Mm,
too. Because, like I
hmm
said, a big focus of mine within my spiritual development was trying to see. Like
hmm
that was just a topic I was always enamored with. The idea of seeing stuff that is spiritually there or energetically there that other, untrained people were not able to see.
hmm
And so I really started to try to dissect how to see in the multiple different ways to see metaphysically, psionically, spiritually, whatever language you want to use.
hmm
Um, and I started to apply seeing auras with the visual snow, just like you said.
Oh, okay.
So
Very
trying to see
cool.
auras represented in the snow, right? Because okay, I can produce shapes in the snow. I can see flashes and kind of transparencies of cloudy things going by in the snow. What else can I do with it? Well, let's
hmm
try to see auras. Let's try to see energy, right? Let's try to see. This one's funny, but even like if this has only happened a handful of times. I can't reproduce it,
hmm
and this isn't even physically how it works. But anyway, I'm sitting there relaxing and my cell phone's on the table or something and I see a streak of light and then my cell phone goes off. Right.
Wow.
So that's not how a cell signal radiates, right? But
Right, right.
somehow it seemed my brain was trying to make sense in a way that I could interpret
hmm
some energetic phenomena reaching my phone. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I
At
love
least
that.
if we could reproduce that, that's what I would know it was. I'm not sure because it's
Right.
only
Well, I
happened a few
think,
times.
yeah, no, I think that our awareness, our consciousness or whatever is interpreting, energy. And we were talking earlier about, how there's this whole like everything is composed of energy and the energy fields and all these things or whatever. I don't know if I can get into all that yet, but yeah, that we're essentially interpreting this energy and making sense of it and doing that through like our interpretation of it. And
Mm-hmm.
so that would make sense how you were doing that, and knowing the knowingness of I am receiving a call and then seeing that experience of it happening visually, intuitively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, potentially.
Yeah.
Which I love thinking about that because if that's reproducible, that's pretty exciting. If human
hmm
beings actually have the capacity to see signals like that we think are out of the visual spectrum, maybe there are parts of our brain that actually can process that information that we just don't have full access to most of the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm very curious about all these things too. Like there's a few deep dives that I've done about, seeing things, using your mind's eye. There's a couple of different videos that I've watched, people who have, blindfolded either they have blindfolded themselves or they are blind and they have learned how to use their inner vision to see. And so essentially it's this whole video of look, there's a couple different videos, okay, one with blind people but another one with kids, and the one I'm going to talk about is the one with kids where they've got the whole like headgear and they've blinded, you've probably seen this, right? They've blinded themselves and they're running around doing obstacle courses, they're reading books, they're throwing the ball at each other, they're catching it, and it's like, and this kid is like reading the book, right, word for word, complete, and the person's like turning the page, you don't know what the thing is. Yeah.
Totally. I got introduced to that idea through probably the same videos. I just ran across them years ago.
He actually
And I
looks
remember,
like you. I had a moment where I was like,
yeah,
maybe it
yeah,
was
yeah,
him. And
yeah,
maybe it's you. Maybe that's who I'm talking about.
yeah. I'm forgetting his name, but yes, I know exactly who you're
Yeah.
talking about.
Yeah.
um, uh, Frank, I want to say, but
Mm-hmm.
anyway, so that idea I ran across through his videos too, and I went, "That's incredible," and sort of in line with some of the stuff I had already been practicing. I just didn't
Mm-hmm.
know that people had honed it into that amount. So, but I was still kind of skeptical about it. I was like, I mean, video is tricky because you could make a lot of things seem
Yeah.
one way, right, through editing and stuff. But I had the honor of seeing somebody do that in person.
Oh,
Met a,
really?
yeah, I met a Spanish, they were from Mexico, I believe, a family that had a school in Mexico that taught kids how to do that. And they
Wow.
had their daughter there who had just been raised on doing it. And
Mm-hmm.
so
Mm-hmm.
at the time she was 13, and they're like, "You want to see a demonstration?" And me and my friend were like, "Absolutely." We were
Yeah,
at a
totally.
spiritual convention. And so she blindfolded herself, maybe 4 or 5 layers.
Mm-hmm.
We verified, yep, no holes, no nothing. Okay. And they're like, grab whatever you have. And we had like a magazine program or something, 100 pages or something, 20, I don't know how long it
Mm-hmm.
was. Flipped to a random page, pointed to the point on the page to read, and she just started reading right there. And so after that, my friend and I were a bit dumbstruck, just walking around with our mouths hanging open a little bit. But that was
Yeah.
cool as at least a final confirmation that, okay, what I've been working on, what other people seemingly on the internet have been working on, does seem possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually, I'm glad you brought that up. That's actually the thing that I'm circling back to in my own journey right now and trying to hone in
Mm-hmm.
is the blindfold seeing. I'm still not very good at it, but
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, you know what? This reminds me. There's a movie by, not by, but with Benedict Cumberbatch. I don't know how to say his name. You know what I'm talking about?
Wes
Benedict
Anderson.
Cumberbatch. Yeah, the one Cumberbatch.
Cumberbatch.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but it's the recent movie where it's done like with little like you know what I'm talking about? You know the movie
Oh
I'm
yeah.
talking about?
Henry Sugar.
Yeah. And he's essentially like using that vision, that same
Mm-hmm.
thing. And so the fact that this is becoming like, I'm going to have to put the link down below so people know what I'm talking about, but of like that people can do this. And now that it's becoming in the mainstream, that the fact that they have a mainstream actor like talking about this, doing this short little film about like this phenomenon, I mean, this reminds me of like the whole 100th monkey thing, or like, the whole, like, what is it, like 4 or 6 minute mile? I don't know what it is, but like, it was unheard of, for millennia, not millennia, but you know what I mean, of not running like a certain amount of speed. But then as soon as somebody did it, right, and everybody became aware that it was possible, then everybody started doing it.
Yeah.
Then it was completely possible. And so I am really curious that this starts happening, because it's tickling everybody's curiosity. And they've done this video in such a way that it's intriguing, to the mainstream society as a possibility, and I wonder if this is part of the process, the process that they've outlined in this particular movie. Is this one of the ways to do it? And if so, is everybody going to start doing this?
Well, you know what's hilarious about what you just said and that movie in general? So I
uh,
had come up with my own way to practice this
mm-hmm,
skill. And I had been practicing for months. I think I started really practicing that at the end of 2022.
mm-hmm,
Um,
mm-hmm,
and sporadically, but some days, some weeks I'll really lay into it just for fun. And it
mm-hmm.
was mainly with playing cards. And my dad sent me the video, the movie. He's like, "Son, watch this movie now." Cause he knew, him and I
You
have been
knew,
practicing a little
you
bit
knew what
together.
you were
Yeah.
doing. Yeah.
And I was getting some success. And so watching the movie, I was like, what the heck? Like it's got
Yeah. The
some of
movie's
the
all about
same,
you.
yeah, like some of the
Totally.
same ideas just right in
Yeah.
there. It was pretty fun. But yeah, I totally agree with you. I'd love to think that that is the effect that will come from that sort of thing hitting the mainstream, as the 100 monkey sort of thing, where it just becomes more standardized, normalized, and then experienced collectively. I would imagine it would take some time, and that's what people like you and I are also trying to bring to the table, like really dissecting spiritual experience abilities and make them reproducible and actually make it more normal. Um,
No. Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things about my abilities. So I had my own, spiritual journey and spiritual awakening. I actually had like an early on experience of just feeling very awake and open and having a lot of like astral projection experiences and spiritual phenomenon. And then it was really weird because I had this astral projection where I was like climbing up like this giant cliff, right? And I was peering up over, and I was supposed to be seeing like all these like really wise like people up in the astral realm or whatever, who they were going to be talking about like the mysteries of the universe, right? And I was going to like hear in on like everything that I've ever wanted to know about like why we're here and why things exist and blah 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 blah, right? And so I peer over, and they see me, and they're like, no, you're not supposed to be here. They knock me off the cliff and they say, you've gotten here too early. You need to rebuild your foundation. Your foundation is shaky and you can't build what you're building on this shaky foundation. So, after that, I kind of like wake up and I'm like, what the hell was that? That was really weird. And none of it like really like immediately manifests. But one of the things that did happen is that I was disconnected from all of like my spiritual understanding about things. I didn't believe in any of the things anymore. I got really sciencey. I got really into like, I don't know that spiritual stuff is like really real, and but then I would see people having like these phenomenon, right? These experiences, and I'm like, if they're having them, there has to be something to it. So how do I duplicate this thing? How do I make this happen? And so it really forced me to break. This is what forced me to really start breaking down everything into an observable process. Like, okay, so if I'm supposed to have these abilities to, like receive visual guidance or receive auditory guidance or whatever, like how is that supposed to happen? And the spiritual community was really of no help to me in that regard anyway. Like you were saying, they said things in a way that didn't really explain things for me. So I needed to find out for myself, and I needed to break it down for myself. And my abilities were like nil at the time. They were like almost nothing. So I had to observe the subtlest, smallest nuances of my abilities, and then turn up the volume to everything, turn up the volume to each of them, and then observe what is that like and what does that mean or whatever. And so it was that process. And I didn't know that I was going to teach like this stuff. I just started doing like videos about, other things, but I did like one video, I think on YouTube, about psychic development, just kind of sharing like some of my experiences, and people were like, that's what I experienced. Those are the things. And that's kind of what really brought me into this particular field. Um, but I really felt like I didn't know anything because I was starting from nothing and like developing it. But that's, like I said, that's really taught me to be that scientific observer of all these things. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. It is, that observation is super helpful. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
this, I'm so glad we got connected because you're speaking my language on so many levels. Like you and I have really had a similar process in terms of dissecting and trying to understand and making things reproducible. Um, and my mind still works very scientifically. Like, um, and even now for myself, I've kind of moved away from things that require only faith, right, and belief,
Mm-hmm.
into trying to focus more on the things that I can reproduce and that are measurable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is why I
Mm-hmm.
love a deck of playing cards to practice with, because there's no subjectivity there. It's like I either got it or I didn't,
Right.
right?
Right. Right.
And so a 60% after a deck seeing red or black, which should be statistically impossible, that's objectively, statistically significant. And
Yeah.
that's the kind of stuff that's getting me really excited, because then it's like, well, we're no longer only talking about, well, I went and saw a giant turtle in the sky and, had this
Right,
interesting
totally.
experience, right? And it told me all
Yeah.
these things that we'll never be able to measure or anything, but if people were listening, they could take if they wanted. Instead of that, now it's like, for me, it's this focus of what can we reproduce and how can we actually apply it and how can it be practical for reality that we experience with our bodies as well.
Mm-hmm.
And the bridge over, from what we call spiritual into physical reality
Mm-hmm.
that
So
affects us here.
how would you like to see these things being used as we move on into our future with all these things?
That's a really good question. How would I like to see them being used? I'm not sure if I've ever even really thought about how.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it's always been, the part that excites me is just the possibility of humans having more potential
Mm-hmm.
than what we
Mm-hmm.
currently understand.
Yeah.
How we use it, I suppose, is it's kind of like asking how are we going to use a paintbrush. Well,
Totally.
you can paint a whole lot of different things with it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess people could use it for whatever they want and however they want. And what kind of society comes from the other side of that development, I don't know.
How would you like
Um,
to use it?
it's also a good question. I'm not sure. Um,
All
I
right,
mean,
let's simplify it. What would you like
yeah.
to do as you move into your future with your business and the things that you're teaching and doing and the things that you're striving to learn and create and manifest? What comes next with that?
Well, for the abilities side, what gets me stoked is kind of the same what I said for just the mass, how I look at the entire planet, which is just exploring my potential.
Mm-hmm,
What
mm-hmm,
potential do I have that I don't know or haven't explored or haven't expressed yet? And really seeing those things be expressed. Can I see outside of time? Can I see outside of space? Can I get information from way far beyond myself or back ages ago or about somebody else? Or can I affect reality physically around me?
mm-hmm,
Those are
mm-hmm,
the things. And I don't even know, like, this question is very interesting to me. What would you like to see with it? Because I don't know if I've ever even really thought of it like that. I guess it made me excited to explore those potentials.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Um, and so in terms of what I'm building and why I teach what I teach and why I've explored what I've explored for myself is all just about that. It's just, I'm so excited to unlock the potential of myself and then in other people,
mm-hmm,
and I would love that what comes out on the other side. I mean, this would be kind of a stock answer, but more like peace and love and
mm-hmm,
compassion and stuff. And I hope those are byproducts, but um, I'm not sure that even that hasn't even necessarily been a focus of mine. I do
mm-hmm,
train people and I don't use my stuff that I've unlocked for myself, whatever measure I have. I try to be responsible with those things and be aware of emotional and spiritual boundaries for people,
mm-hmm,
um, and not overstep, right? Or intrude on somebody else's space or energy or whatever. And
mm-hmm,
so in my trainings, I have, of course, I've tried to encourage people to treat it like that. Like, hey, this isn't just a tool to go wreck people or go look somewhere you shouldn't or aren't given permission to. Um, so I hope we all use our powers for good, so to speak. But um,
right. Yeah.
I'm not fully in control of that. Just for myself, and I can always encourage my audience or my students to do the same. But what
Mm-hmm.
world we create on the other side, I don't fully know.
Yeah.
Um, I guess what I'd like to see is people being able to use what they actually have available to them readily.
Mm-hmm.
Because I feel like most of us, most humanity, in fact, likely has a lot of ability that they're constantly using, but don't know how, or
Mm.
don't know that it's even operating. I don't think it takes a person practicing manifestation to actually manifest their life.
Yeah.
I think people are doing that constantly without knowing that they're the ones. Partly, we were talking about this before we jumped on, but I think there's a fine line there, but partly their new job came to them because of that manifestation ability, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's one of the things that I noticed, when I was like redeveloping all my abilities, and, trying to figure out and discern between like what is my own imagination versus like what is guidance, or, like if I'm trying to find my keys, and I see an image of them being, between the cushion, was that like, my memory, coming with that, or was that, being given to me, and trying to discern between those particular things. And what I realized is that we're actually receiving a lot more of that information than we realize, and that it's not necessarily from our own limited consciousness, but from that greater consciousness, that all pervasive consciousness that is giving that information to us. And so I realized that, and the more that I had actually just like accepted that as reality, that okay, I am actually receiving a lot more of this guidance than I realized, then all of a sudden I started receiving a lot more. Like it became a lot stronger and a lot clearer because I distinguished between those things and realized that. So yeah, I agree with you. People are a lot more capable and doing these things way more than they realize.
Right. You're like, it's like what I was saying earlier about being able to recognize what I already had and then fully being able to embrace what I already had. It tends to open up
Mm-hmm.
the rest of what that is, whatever that you recognize, the thing about, but then the peripheral too can start to blossom in other areas, and really the canvas becomes clearer, right? That's why, circling all the way back around, that's why it's so important to recognize mind's eye versus prophantasia versus these different types of spiritual sight. Otherwise, we just hear stories of somebody having a vision and thinking that it may be one thing that it actually wasn't, right? Um,
Yeah.
I
Yeah. No,
remember,
and I love that.
yeah, I remember this workshop my friend was teaching, and he talked about having a vision of his friend waving at him, and then he talked about he was in in a shower, and he had given me permission to jump in during this thing if I felt necessary. And so talked about this vision he had. His friend waved at him. He saw him wave at him, and then after he got out of the shower, there was a text waiting from his friend, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, or no. After he got out of the shower, he texted his friend and he said, "Yeah, I was actually thinking about you and praying for you 5 minutes ago when he was still in the shower."
Wow.
Okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
that's what happened. Um, but I could tell that it was probably a workshop of about 20 people or so. I could tell the people there only heard the word vision and likely were contextualizing it as something that maybe it wasn't, right? So I jumped in, hey, so let me know, just I'm going to dig in with you a little bit because I want everybody to
Mm.
recognize what you're talking about and that they may be doing it too. But let's define the actual experience. So you were in the shower. Were your eyes open or closed? He goes, I think I closed them. Okay. So your eyes, you're seeing the black space. Was it more a sense in the mind of an image of your friend, or was it more projected like this out in front of you? And he goes, oh, no, it's just in the mind. Okay. On a scale of 0% to 100%, 100% being very, very vivid and lifelike, 0% being just black, how much of your friend did you see? Like, how vivid was it? He was like, oh, probably about 30%. Right. Not vivid, not very clear. How long did it last? I think I even asked. Really fast, maybe a
Mm-hmm.
second, maybe a second and a
Mm-hmm.
half. Right. Not
Yeah.
not long, not vivid, not dramatic. It was just a fleeting moment that ran across his consciousness while he was in the shower, and he took action on it when he got out of the shower, asking his friend if he had been thinking about him, and sure enough, he had.
Yeah.
When we defined that, everybody in the whole workshop had this moment of, oh, like, oh my gosh, okay. So him saying vision wasn't this thing that we were maybe interpreting it as, but it's just a very simple, really mental image that happened to stream across his consciousness.
Yeah. Oh my God. And I love that. I love that so much. I love that so much because like this goes back to the whole thing of like us not realizing all the things that we're probably doing all the time. Like how many times are like we have that image in our mind, like a friend pops into our head and then we're just like, whatever, and we'll just like push it away and we won't take action on it. And this is one of the things that I teach when I teach is like when you see the thing, take action on it, like do it, because that is validating that experience. And the more that you validate that experience, the stronger it's going to get. But yeah, it's happening to us all the time. Like we're disregarding it because we're expecting this greater phenomenon, right? Because of the media, because of all the movies, because of all the whatevers, right? And they make it to be larger than life. And so we expect to see it in this certain way. And we disregard all these other things as, well, that's just my imagination, or I'm just making that thing up, or they just came to mind because they just came to mind or whatever. But if they really, like you said, like went down into it, like, okay, I'm going to call this person, I'm going to validate this experience, I'm going to listen to my intuition about what I need to do and how I need to act on that, that you actually find that all those things were significant.
Right. And for me personally, it was a process of years of putting weight to those subtle experiences. Thing after thing would happen that I'd go, oh, that was more significant than I realized. Just like what you're saying, I love telling stories. Is it okay if I tell another story?
Yeah, tell more. Love them.
So this goes in line exactly with what you were saying. So during my second year at that school I was at in Northern California, I remember one day I was practicing astral projection at the time, a lot. And so we were doing our worship set or whatever. There was music playing in the room and everybody was into it. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to practice. I'm not going to fully astral project because I can't fall asleep here, but I'm just going to practice, I don't know, mentally walking around. Right. And so I laid down and I relaxed. And then I tried to imagine myself as best I could, just in my mind, nothing else, no physical sight, no nothing, no vision. I'm not going to use the word vision here. But I imagined myself standing next to my body. It was pretty vague, not very clear. I just used what I could. I was like, okay, kind of start walking around, went up towards the stage, right? I was trying to just, I don't know, put blessings on people or something as I went. When I got up towards the stage, something else, it felt like, spoke to me and said, somebody's going to see you. And so I was like, okay. So I just waited, rested for a second. I didn't notice anything in particular. Still very vague imagery because it was all just in my mind. I was still even aware of my body laying there too. I wasn't like in a dream or anything. And so I go, okay. So I'm just kind of sitting there for a second and then I kept moving. After, this is not exaggeration on the story, after I get out of class that day, a friend walks up to me who at the time had been astral projecting all the time. He was in a season of life. It was just this phenomenon he was experiencing all the time. He came up to me and he said, hey, I saw you earlier. And I was like, what do you mean you saw me? And he's like, you know exactly what I mean. And he's like, I was up near the stage, out of my body. I was sitting on the chairs physically, but I was up near the stage, out of my body. You came up to the stage, you looked right at me, you waved at me. And then you just walked off. And I went, okay, well, that's cool. That was way more intense than I had been experiencing it. Yeah. What's strange about that, right, though, is his interpretation or the energy of what was happening where he was receiving the event had extra information. I find that interesting.
Right. Yeah.
That I wasn't consciously aware of. I did stop and recognize, but on his end, he saw an actual wave.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that. Actually, and this reminds me of this story because I used to teach astral projection and lucid dreaming like quite a lot. Now I don't teach it as much as I used to, but there's this story, and I'll probably like mess it up, but I'll do my best. Where this person was astral projecting to their girlfriend or something like that, and the girlfriend was like out of town in a completely different country at the time, and so he's astral projecting to go and visit her and see what she's up to, right? And so he gets there and he sees like all these vampire bats or something like that, and he's like, what the heck is going on? He can't figure out, but he can see her in the living room, like on the couch or whatever, and he's like, this is really weird. And so he gets back into his body, right? And then he gives her a call and he's like, hey, I just astral projected. I was trying to see what was going on. It was really weird because you were surrounded by all these bats or something like that. And she's like, that is so weird because I was just watching this show about like vampires or whatever. And so his interpretation of that was like her mental like experience of like all of that or whatever. And the other thing that's interesting too is like a lot of people when they talk about astral projection, like they'll see like furniture or things that existed in that house like a long time ago, and like that imprint of those things will still be there. So I haven't figured it all out. Like I'm still trying to figure out exactly what that is that you're talking about, that he's seeing you waving and he's seeing these things, but clearly there's extra energetic information that they're picking up on, in that experience.
Yeah, some exchange, right? That I
Yeah.
wasn't conscious of, that he, whatever it was, interpreted a certain way, right? Super fascinating. Yeah, the extra objects. I don't know what that's about either in astral projection. It's super weird.
Yeah.
Things that weren't in the room at the time, or doubled up, even things that maybe are
Yeah.
duplicated, like ceiling fans, things like that.
Well, I
Strange.
love that you had the validation though. I mean, it's so rare to have like that kind of validation and that experience,
Right.
and have somebody else like immediately confirm that experience of you being like not even a full astral projection, right? You're not even like
Not
essentially
even
like
close.
completely out of your body, but you're a mental like projection, and he is aware of you being in that mental projection having that experience. I mean, that is the confirmation on that is just unfathomable. I love it.
Yeah, that was a turning point for me, because I realized the low level of thing that I was trying to do, that was very vague and not very in depth, was actually a lot more than I thought it was potentially. So,
Yeah.
and those confirmations year after year was what made me put more weight to those types of experiences, and even want to dig into the science of it more. Because if it's
Hmm.
reproducible like that and we can actually measure the effect, then what's stopping the scientific process from happening around those topics? Nothing, except taboo within, the mainstream
Exactly.
scientific field, or
Exactly.
mainstream conversation,
I mean, they
which I'm
they
just,
did touch on it at points, like
yeah,
the movie like Men with Goats or whatever it is, where they're talking about how the military had used like psychic abilities or whatever, and like Russia and all these things. So I mean, like we've touched on like wanting to do these things in a bigger way, but like you said, it is such a taboo subject of something. But I think it's because like it's hard to measure and it's not tangible and people can't explain it yet, and because people can't explain it in a scientific way, they're like, it's not really real or whatever, you know.
right, in a physical way, right?
Right.
Because some of the scientific process of some of those very research organizations, like SRI, that's the movie Men Who Stare at Goats was
Hmm.
going off of some of that work at SRI in the remote viewing programs.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but we can measure stuff scientifically through the scientific process and reproduce those sorts of effects of, let's say, remote viewing, but we can't explain it with our current models of physics yet. So that's like the bottleneck. Since it can't be explained physics wise, then it must not be part of reality, right? Which is, I just got done reading Rupert Sheldrake's book. Actually, I'm almost done.
Hmm.
The Science Delusion is what it's called, and he talks about the main dogmas of science, and some of them very much are belief systems, much as with religion, that
Hmm.
only can take you so far, and then there's phenomena that happen either consciously or in reality itself that we can't explain with those current models. So our models of physics and energy and things like that are going to have to catch up uh, before I feel the full adoption of what we're trying to talk about, right?
Well, maybe it'll happen concurrently, as
Yeah.
they start to realize these things, they realize that they're going to have to shift like their understanding. I mean, just like quantum physics did like a lot, for like the new age, like modality or whatever. And everybody is like, oh, manifestation this and, all these different things or whatever, just based on like some ideas in quantum physics that they haven't completely, validated still or whatever. But I think that what we're realizing is that we're going to have to look at a completely new like understanding of like reality to accept all of these things as possibilities, and how can these things like occur, how can we create a model of that so that we
Hmm.
validate like all of these things.
Yeah, I think you're spot on with that. I think you're spot on that they will develop concurrently, or at least they have the opportunity to, right?
Yeah.
So
Oh, I love
yeah,
that.
that's part of what I am hoping my work. Actually, this ties back into what you were asking me earlier. What do you want to see from your work?
Hmm.
Um, that's one of the biggest things, is helping to bridge that gap between just having haphazard common phenomena with spiritual practitioners or whoever, to actually being able to scientifically measure, reproduce, and capture data around some of those things.
Hmm.
Helping to prove that point that, hey, we need better models of what we think our reality is all about. Um, and that then, of course, just developing myself and people, like I was saying before, with potential. But these things
Nice.
can all be measured, and if you develop if you structure a study correctly with the scientific process, we can measure psionic phenomenon. And I love that idea. And it has been done, actually. As I was digging more into it, more and more, there's plenty of data, there's plenty of research, there's plenty of groups. It just hasn't broken quite past the taboo that we're talking about. But
Hmm. 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 Well, I feel like energetically we're starting to come to a close. So I want you, if you feel like it, to share a little bit more about the work that you do, if you're interested in that, for the viewers, in case they want to reach out to you, and anything also that you just want to like share as some of your last words here that might benefit people.
sure. Um, yeah. So the work I do over the past, I started everything in 2018. That's when I really started to teach um, around psionic phenomena and aphantasia stuff, mind's eye stuff. I used to have those separate, so I was scared at the time of the overlap of spirituality and academia. I didn't want to close any doors. But eventually I just got to be myself, and we got to grow up and actually explore things that are uh, more controversial, if there are legitimate phenomena here. So they're all combined under one roof, which I call the Research Center for Developing Consciousness. Name pending. I already rebranded, but I'm considering rebranding again.
I'm like
Goes
that
back.
too. I keep on feeling like I need to rebrand.
Yeah. I haven't quite found the lasting one yet. Um, but so that's what I call it right now. My website's gorcdc.com. Like I mentioned, I have gone fully open source with my information. So my exercises, concepts, techniques in terms of mind's eye work and Prophantasia work are all on my website, on my blog. There's a big post I did. It's actually the size of a book. Uh, Called the mental imagery mega guide, or something like that, mega guide. So
Hmm.
if people want to know about aphantasia, how to make your mind's eye stronger, that's a good place to start if you want to start tweaking around, playing around on your own. Um, if you want to access things that are a little more structured, would hold your hand a little more, I offer e-courses through my Teachable course, which you can also find the link through on my site, gorcdc.com. And then, of course, I do one-on-one work, but that's very limited, since I also work full-time in finance. So I only
Hmm.
take about 2 clients every month and a half or 2.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and then in terms of my psionic work, my intuition training and stuff, that is technically open source as well. I'll just talk about everything. I'll talk about any exercises and stuff, but I haven't put any of it in writing yet. So that's a work in progress. I do want to do the same kind of info dump at some point that I did with the mind's eye work, It's just there's a lot more. There's a ton more that I would have to put in there because of the branching topics and areas myself that I've explored in that realm. So that's TBA. I don't know.
Clearly, we'll have to do another video together all about that, because now I'm super curious about all those things.
I'm down. This has been super
Awesome.
fun.
Awesome.
I told you before we jumped on, but I want your audience to hear it too. You're just so welcoming and honoring, and I love the vibe that you carry. And yeah,
Thank
it's
you.
been just a pleasure. So
Well, it has been amazing having you on here, and thank you so much for agreeing to be here with me. I really appreciate it. And yeah, you guys, so I'm talking to the audience here, everybody. I will put down all of his information below, so please make sure to check that out. And thank you so much, Alec, for joining us today. I look forward to our next session together where we can talk more about psionics. So thank you. Thank you so much.
thank you.